So, welcome to the Air Transport and Services breakout session. This is an incredibly diverse topic. So what we're going to try to do is address some of the questions you might have. We're using Slido. So hopefully if you've been at the conference for the last couple of days, you've already logged in. If you haven't, there's an app, or you can just go to slido.com. The conference code is 4167, and you need to make sure you're in the right room or the right section so that the questions will come through to the panel. Otherwise, they'll go through to the digital panel and they'll all get a bit confused. So it's Vox 4, the Air Transport Vision. So we've heard a lot from different people so far in the conference on a whole range of different topics. What I wanted to do before we start is just get back to, how did we get here? Let's take a step back. Aviation is changing, and it's probably going to change at a faster rate than it has done before, and increasingly so. People talk about the third revolution in aerospace being electrification. It's had an awful lot of press coverage recently. I'm not sure I agree with that. So let's have a quick look at why. So what was the first revolution in aerospace? Well, of course, it was the birth of flight itself. The Wright brothers. They did a pretty incredible thing, although actually the distance they managed to fly was less than the wingspan of a 747. What was the second revolution? I'm sure most of the people in this room have a view on that. So the second revolution was getting us long haul. So it was the gas turbine enabling convenient long distance travel, connecting the world in a way that wasn't previously possible. So back to my earlier point. The third revolution in aerospace. So I think it's actually flexing how we fly. That's just how I've chosen to put it for this particular discussion. So what does that mean? I think it means using the airspace in a different way and being flexible in how we do so. It doesn't have to just be getting on a Ryanair flight to Spain anymore. It could be drones delivering services, such as building inspection, railway inspection. It could be eVTOL helping us get around cities. It could be smaller, potentially electric aircraft getting us to smaller airports in a more point-to-point way, connecting places that are actually currently quite hard to connect through ground-based transport. But it also reads up to large aircraft. So it's looking at how do we use more flexible routing to make large aircraft more efficient as well. So my argument is that the third revolution in aerospace is that flexibility, how we use the airspace. Electrification is simply the enabler. The reduction in size and weight of electrical technology is the enabler for that, in the same way that the gas turbine was the enabler for the second revolution. But electrification is not the third revolution in itself. So hopefully you've all picked up a copy of the strategy. Looks like Phil's getting it out of his bag as we speak, so he can check that I'm saying the right things. We set out under the air transport section 3 key priorities. The first one was to set an ambitious sustainability agenda, the second to address mobility challenges, and the third to raise UK competitiveness. Now, those of you that have worked with the ATI in the past will know that some of these are outside the traditional boundaries of what the ATI has funded. That's true, but it doesn't stop us signposting where we see things that need to change in order to enable the core of what we do fund, which is ultimately the vehicles. We're also working very closely with Gary Cutts and the Future Flight Challenge, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So the first one is to set an ambitious sustainability agenda. I'm not going to say too much about this because the following breakout session will cover sustainability, and a fair amount has already been touched on in the conference, other than to say, if you look at that list, again, you'll notice it's not just about the vehicle. Addressing the mobility challenges. So on this one, what is our vision for the future? My personal view is that for the majority of people, air transport in the medium term, and let's call that 10 to 15 years won't see a huge difference in the aircraft that they fly. They'll still be tube and wing. They'll have increasing levels of technology in a range of areas, but they fundamentally won't look much different. For people that aren't aerospace or aviation people, they probably will struggle to notice the difference. And actually, the biggest thing that people notice when they fly is the interior. Will we remove all the windows and just have a projected vision of the outside rather than having a window? That might be lighter, maybe. People will see things like urban air mobility as being different, but initially, they will be expensive. It seems to be unfashionable at the moment to be putting something into service that will be expensive. People say, well, unless it's a solution for the masses, we shouldn't be doing it. It's not fair and equitable. Well, the reality is, all new technology is expensive when it first comes to market. It's just one of those things. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And the only way we can get to a reasonable cost is to grow the system through getting over that expensive first phase. And most importantly, from an ATI perspective, raising UK competitiveness. The UK, as we've talked about throughout the conference so far, cannot afford to stand still because there are many other competitors out there that would be more than happy to replace our position in the global aerospace and aviation industry. So I touched on the Future Flight Challenge earlier, and you'll see the difference in the slides. I've literally borrowed this slide from Gary Cutts. The Future Flight Challenge is designed to look at the whole system, look at all the different bits of it. And as I said, we're working really closely with our colleagues in Innovate and UKRI to look at how we tailor this with the ATI programme. Because we've got to be joined up on this. Ultimately, we're spending UK government money to help the UK be more competitive. We can't afford to replicate effort. The most important thing I'll say is that, as Gary strongly advocates to anybody that's spoken to him, this is a system-level problem. It's not enough to look at it in siloed approaches. So you cannot just have a vehicle, an eVTOL vehicle, if you don't have a way to charge it, if you don't have a way to manage it through the airspace. Eventually you will run out of capacity. That's not to say we can't get things moving. If I had an eVTOL vehicle today, I could clear it in the airspace for limited flights. So let's use that capability as a stepping stone, but we need to start now thinking about what's going to come next. How are we going to enable this bright future that's been outlined so far in the conference? So, moving on to the panel. They've been sitting here very patiently listening to me talk. First of all, we've got Mike Gadd from Altitude Angel. Second, we've got Mark Westwood from the Connected Places Catapult. And third, we've got Robert Thompson from Roland Berger. So what we're going to do now is each of the panelists is going to come up and give a short presentation and hopefully provoke some different thinking within the audience. And then we will go into the Q&A session. So just a final reminder, if you haven't loaded up Slido, I suggest you do so now. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mike.
Good afternoon, everyone, and firstly, thank you for the invitation. I've been 40 years in aviation, a large proportion of that as a regulator, but I'm now with a small tech company called Altitude Angel, and we already deliver urban air mobility and UTM management capabilities. We've heard over the last few days, yesterday a lot about the vehicles, this morning about the supportive infrastructure and the connectivity that's going to be necessary to solve this. I'm now with a company that is looking to solve that air traffic management position, simply because if we don't look at that invisible infrastructure, we'll all have some nice shiny new toys and no way to use them. So a year ago tomorrow, we demonstrated the use of a platform that does this. actually flying multiple drones at Manchester International Airport without disrupting the day-to-day manned air traffic, because we integrated the data sets to allow them to do that and share the airspace safely. So the technology that Airbus and Boeing were talking about, we as a UK company did that a year ago and are routinely supporting unmanned aircraft operations around the world using that platform. And it covers everything, from the flight planning side through the authorization, tactical and strategic deconfliction, through to post-flight analysis. However, that's not really the bit that Dave asked me to be a little bit controversial about, or to stimulate some questions anyway. My engagement within the regulatory domains would say that all of what we have today in terms of an aviation framework is great. It's there, it's been 70 odd years in the making. But it's very siloed. What I mean by that is I can have the airworthiness of the aircraft, I can have the licensing of the crew, the operations and the air traffic services. If any one of those has a problem, the humans in the loop can continue to operate safely. If I lose my air traffic control, I still have a radio to talk to somebody else. I can still fly safely, find an alternate airport. We started talking about urban air mobility, and I'm with Dave on this one also. For me, this is not revolutionary. That's why I have a helicopter in that top picture. Urban air mobility doesn't offer any new capability that I can't do today with a helicopter, unless and except their reliance on the new technology to simplify the flying of the aircraft, to manage it in high volumes, routinely, means a greater dependency on digital connectivity, external data sources, and not talking to human air traffic control because of the potential volumes or proximity that they wish to operate in. So this is a bridge to that fantastic world that everybody's saying of automation, autonomy, whatever the genuine phrase needs to be. But for me, it's not totally revolutionary, because it's using the technology that's been built for unmanned aircraft to facilitate larger vehicles, doing things that unmanned aircraft already do. So for me, the revolution is that digital infrastructure, that data connectivity, that sharing of information, and how all of these ecosystems come together to facilitate greater access to the airspace, a finite resource that needs to be equitably shared if we are to have a truly competitive environment. So for me, the challenges are not about the technology. We will solve those technical issues when we understand the problem that they can address. But we are delivering a service to the consumer, and we are all consumers. So we don't care about how the magic happens. How many of us have said, is it a Boeing or an Airbus that I'm going to catch tomorrow? We're much more interested in how fast, how much, is it comfortable, what am I getting? Does it drive? Does it deliver what I'm looking for? It's a service. And it's not just about aviation. This is that competition thing. We are a transport sector. We are one of many ways of getting from A to B. And as the dynamics shift and the dynamics change, as consumers, we will look at how we get to where we want to go or have our goods delivered based on a few things. And it's not going to be the magic. It's going to be how much, how soon, how much pain. And so we will see what's already happening in some sectors, that the aggregation apps, the services that we can get on our mobile phone, where we can just say, I want to go from A to B, how much, what time, book the ticket, and our mobile phone will have all of the tickets, and it will do everything from door to door. irrespective of whether I'm taking a taxi cab, a train, a driverless car, or an aircraft. The seamless integration of these things is what the service industry is already starting to do. And the monetization behind that, so that we pay once and get all of the tickets, is already prevalent in the mobile phone industry. We should expect this type of revolution in data services to impact aviation. These are the revolutions that we have to be prepared for, because if we're not, we won't be in that transport game. That's my view. And I'll hand over to Mark.
Hello, everybody. My name's Mark Westwood, and I'm afraid I've only been in the aerospace industry 20 years, so possibly only half as good as Mike. I'm going to talk to you about future air transport services from the perspective of my organisation. So I work for Connected Places Catapult. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Catapult Network, but just briefly, our objective is to help UK companies capture new market opportunities. And for us, that looks like helping to create prosperous and productive places through harnessing new technology. In the UK, or sorry, globally, that looks like approximately a 1.5 trillion market opportunity for UK companies over the next 10 to 15 years. So pretty significant. And just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we do at the Catapult, kind of things we get involved in. So connecting autonomous vehicles has been quite a major part of our programme over the last 5 years. Example there of a project we're involved with a global OEM, a leading UK university, Cranfield University's autonomous vehicle test track, and a bunch of UK SMEs collaborating to develop globally leading technology here in the UK on UK roads. We've been doing exactly the same thing in the drone space, working with government, regulator and industry to look at first-of-a-kind deployments of drones in beyond visual line of sight scenarios to try and unlock that market. And just drawing on some of the points Mike was making, we very much see tools like UTM as being the next critical thing to help enable scale operation of these devices. And also things like digitization, digital twins of both the built environment and also parts of our transport system. So we've worked with leading companies in, for example, the computer gaming market to apply their technology into helping Highways England understand how we manage our roads. So it just gives you a flavour of the kinds of activity we're involved in. So for me, I'm going to respectfully disagree with Mike, actually, and so I think this is a revolution in aviation that we're seeing through the possibilities of this new technology. I say this as someone who was excited by amazing platforms when I was a child, and that's what got me into aerospace. So seeing incredible aircraft like, I don't know, Vulcan or Challenger Space Shuttle, that was what really excited me. And then, having worked in the industry for a while, I began to drift away because it appeared that the kind of innovation was incremental. And at the point where you can't easily tell the difference between one tube and wing and another tube and wing, I think that was where I decided that I wanted to go and explore opportunities like the self-driving car market. But now, to me, this industry looks like it's absolutely the exciting place that we want to be. Now the question is, and I think, again, drawing on the other presentations, how do we actually want to use this technology, and what's the long-term vision for the difference it can make within the transport market? Now, the kind of challenges that we see in transport are things like system capacity. So be that on the roads, on rail, in the air, in all of those different modes, the story is the same. The story is that they are full. And we cannot build our way out of the capacity challenges, for example, with our road network. And often the infrastructure cost is enormous. So, the rough cost for building a mile of motorway in the UK is something like 20 to 30 million pounds, and you build it once and you can't move it anywhere else. For things like high-speed rail, you can think of a figure maybe 10 times the value of that. So other modes of transport really do require large infrastructure investment, and once you've made that choice, the choice is there for 50 plus years. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity with some of the new air transport concepts to have a much more flexible infrastructure. And finally, the thing that we've heard a lot about over the last couple of days, the need to have a zero carbon solution. I think that's really important. And the key question for me is, so how does UAM and how the different use cases of UAM fit within the UK transport network, and what problems can they help us solve? In terms of takeaways, just things to think about. This is a graph that was produced at the recent Uber Elevate conference back in June, and it shows their vision for how they're going to make this kind of transport affordable. And the key things for me is that it requires real concentration on load factor and utilisation. And the only way you can drive that is to have a much closer relationship with other transport modes. And that's a mixture of both physical and digital domains. So, for example, if you're going to have a truly seamless journey through the app that Mike was just talking about, that's going to require data sharing between a whole series of ground infrastructure that doesn't share it at the moment and another industry that's yet to build that solution. But those are the key building blocks that will help make this profitable. We've also talked a little bit over the last couple of days about public engagement, and I think it's probably fair to say that's another area where as a community we really need to focus on collaborating, because I would guess that not many of us in this room have a clear view of how we address the public engagement angle. And it's a real area for social science to be brought into this community to help make sure the services are services that people want. And finally, which is going to be the use case, the killer use case that makes this work? And my suggestion would be that it may well be a use case based on the transport of goods before it becomes transport of people within the UK. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for coming to listen to us this afternoon. I'm Robert Thompson, partner in the London office of Roland Berger, and I think I've been in the aerospace industry about 30 years, so neatly sandwiched between 20 and 40, the other two gentlemen. I was going to start off just talking about air transport vision with some views on the customer end, let's say, the airline end. And one thing we're seeing very acutely at the moment is the way in which airlines are caught between external pressures from customers, from investors, and from governments, and the absence of any technical solution when it comes to carbon. If we look at consumers, there's a very well publicised stories about flight shaming, and if you look into the stats in Swedish airports, you can already see people flying less in the Nordics than they were before. And you can also see people moving away into alternative forms of transport, and pretty good survey evidence that there is a reduction in demand for air travel at the moment. Secondly, in terms of government actions, you can see eco-taxes. There's talk within the EU that the fuel tax directive will be amended and aviation will no longer be exempt from fuel taxes. There is obviously APD in the UK and analogies of APD coming into place in other countries. And lots of other measures being taken by governments to raise taxes, ostensibly for environmental reasons, often just to raise money full stop. But that doesn't change the fact that it's taking money out of the aviation industry and squeezing the airlines as a result of that. Coupled to government challenges, there's also the net zero target, 2050 in the UK, 2040, I think, in Sweden, 2030 in Norway, and I'll come back to that in a moment and the implications for airlines of that. And then the third aspect of the pressure that airlines are feeling are from investors. At the moment, this is largely a box-ticking exercise, where there is a sustainability department within most big asset management houses, They score airlines on ESG criteria, environmental, societal and governmental criteria, governance criteria. Doesn't really affect the investment decisions which are taken by these asset management houses, but you can feel that the pressure is coming. Aviation is not quite in the same corner as sort of guns and tobacco and gambling at the moment, but heading a little bit in that direction. And you can see some investor groups targeting aviation, and indeed in other industries like the oil industry in particular. Shell was targeted very publicly about this time year by last year by Climate Action 100, and forced to put out all sorts of statements and try and move towards a less carbon-intensive future. So the airlines can feel all of these three types of pressure. And yet, when they go to look at the manufacturers of equipment, there isn't a technical solution at the moment. There are no new aircraft programs around or currently launched. And the revolutionary new technologies, things like sustainable fuels, electrical propulsion, new aircraft architectures, just aren't ready yet at the moment. So there's this awful sandwich which the customer groups are caught in at the moment. When you then look at this challenge in a little bit more detail, the challenge for them, meeting net zero targets by 2050, certainly requires the development of new technologies. This graph starts off on the left-hand side with today's emissions of carbon. Then the dashed box assumes that there will be growth in the future. And this has been something of an article of faith, I think, within the industry. You get 4 to 5% growth per annum. So if you roll forward from today's emissions to a baseline set of emissions for 2050, those in the default assumptions for the industry would be higher than today. Then you think about what you can do. Well, there are various things you can do with today's technology. There's next generation aircraft with conventional propulsion, operational improvements, e-taxiing, engine washing, so on and so forth. And then system level improvements, things like ATC, much talked about already. But when you do the sums and add up all of those, that doesn't get you anywhere near a net zero target for 2050. And you're wholly reliant on new technologies, either electrical propulsion or sustainable fuels or something else like hydrogen. And even with those, when you work through what is plausible from a technical perspective, there is probably still a residual emission at the end of the right-hand side of this graph. So there's a real challenge for the airline industry at the moment, and therefore I think for the aerospace industry as a whole. What does this mean? Well, some enlightened airlines like EasyJet are very keen to take action on their carbon footprint. And I guess some of you will have seen the announcement from EasyJet yesterday that they are, from the 19th of November, from yesterday, going to be offsetting all of the carbon emissions which comes out of the back of the engines on all EasyJet aircraft. So they've taken a very public stance and said that they think, Johan Lundgren stood up yesterday, said climate change is an issue for all of us, and we're going to take action today. But there are a few other airlines which are actually moving in the same direction. EasyJet's keen to reduce the carbon footprint today, that's the offsetting piece, but also keen for long-term work to support the development of new technologies, and ultimately for aviation to reinvent itself. And I think that's the thing which aviation has to do. And if I think about what that could mean from a supplier perspective, from a manufacturer perspective, I mean, 3 or 4 things to think about. One is growth, as I said earlier, been an article of faith that there will be growth in the industry if there are restrictions on air transport, either physical through slot restrictions, no third runway at Heathrow and so on, or economic restrictions like taxes, carbon, paying for carbon and so on, that could very realistically constrain growth in the industry. Second thing I was thinking about is shorter product life cycles. We probably won't be flying around 1960s technology like the 737 much longer. That, of course, means higher R&D, more investment in new technologies to get close to net zero carbon by 2050. Third thing could be a less aftermarket dependent business models for suppliers. If individual product lives as well as product life cycles are shorter, then there's less of an aftermarket for suppliers to make their money in. And then fourthly, I think new types of aircraft. Whenever you look at the technology roadmaps for electrical propulsion, everybody always expects that to come in smaller aircraft before larger. Therefore, will we see small zero-carbon aircraft flying around in perhaps 10, 12 years' time, and that changing the way in which we fly? For shorter haul routes, London, Edinburgh, London, Amsterdam, London, Paris, and so on and so forth. So another form of change within the air transport industry. So that was my first take on this.
Right, so we will proceed to the Q&A. This is a very broad topic, so we'll do our best to answer the questions. I would stress that these will just be the views of the panel rather than any official position. So we'll see how we get on. So the first question, very vision-based, fittingly. Thales showed a video with an air transport vision. There's a question that's come up that says, is it possible to have a single unified vision of future air transport vision at UK level? Mark.
I'll take the short straw on that one. Is it possible? I mean, it's a very good question, and I think I'll come back to what I was talking about in the intro. We need to think long and hard about how we want to use these different types of technology. And I think we don't yet understand where the best places are to offer them. And it's really not just about the air transport piece. There's lots of innovation going on in other different parts of transport. And the autonomous vehicle is a classic one. But, you know, from a UK perspective, the adoption of that kind of technology might lead to some real unintended consequences around congestion. So having a really holistic vision around that would be a great thing. It's certainly something that I've talked to Department for Transport about on a number of occasions, and I think would be certainly a good thing to aim for. But we probably can't rely on government to do it on its own.
Robert, do you have any views?
Yeah, I was just wondering, given the political environment, whether the UK was still a viable entity or not, but that's perhaps a question for a different day. I think that it's necessary to have a vision, but I was wondering whether it's sufficient to have a vision at a UK level, given the level of change and the level of funding which may be needed for new technologies and to change the industry, whether the UK on its own can afford this type of level of funding. And therefore I was thinking, well, perhaps it makes more sense to do so at a regional level rather than a single UK level.
Well, we've managed to cock that up as well.
Yeah,
so,
indeed. So I just think that if one believes in climate change, and I think on balance that I do, I think the scale of the challenge is so large that it's beyond any individual country to fund that and solve the problem. And therefore, collaborative, transnational solutions are inevitable in this area.
Anything to add, Mike? Should better leave it in the middle.
Not much, really. I think there is... I agree that there's a potential that a vision for the UK that sets out what we are aiming at is a good thing. That puts everybody in a clear view of what to aim for, but it allows the industry and other stakeholders to decide how to get there. So I think it's a balance between the depth and constraints of going too far into setting a vision would have in terms of the unintended consequences and constraining how the solution might come about. So I think there is a need for something that gives the ability for industry to understand the objectives and the aiming points, to build business cases to deliver to it, but not at a depth to the degree that we saw in the examples over the last few days.
Thanks. Just to add a few final thoughts from myself, I think, a vision is an interesting question. You could argue that the ATI strategy sets out a vision. Is that a vision that the public can relate to? One of the key conversation points that we've had in the conference so far has been, how do we tell the stories of aerospace? How do we encourage people to think of it in a positive sense? And so actually it's a difficult challenge to think about what question are you trying to answer with that vision? Is it to signpost UK industry? Is it to show where we think industry needs to be improved? Is it to enthuse the general public with the idea of aviation? All of these things would probably have different solutions, both in terms of the content and dissemination. So I'm not sure it's a simple question, but I think it is something that the ATI should also be thinking hard about. Okay, moving on to the next question. Robert, this is rather related to one of your previous comments. So, should government take more of an interventionist approach rather than support the market-driven approach to aviation innovation?
I suppose it depends what type of government we end up with in a few weeks' time. My view on this is, I was just looking around wondering if there's anybody from Biz here or not, but I mean, I'm not sure that government is necessarily good at things like picking winners and intervening and doing things like that. I would have said that ultimately a lot of the innovation comes from companies, quite often from small companies. So there are things that governments can do to stimulate the development of small companies, and I guess there always has been a sort of bit of a SME sort of fandom around government. So I think that government can do things like that, but in terms of really backing big projects, I'm pretty much against that. I think that big projects are hard enough to manage as they are, without also having another set of stakeholders involved, which would complicate the picture even more.
Mark?
So I think for me, I mean, there are certain things I think we should be looking to government to intervene on behalf of us as citizens, where a market-driven approach won't give us the best outcome. A good non-aviation example would be the revolution we see going on with micro-mobility, e-scooters. Suddenly through technology development, these things have become really cheap. And if I went to Paris 9 months ago, and you could not walk on a pavement without tripping over an e-scooter. And that's a market that the market has been allowed to fill a gap there. And actually now there's some legislation coming in France to try and deal with the unintended consequences of that technology being given effectively to some extent a free rein. So I think we just need to think about what it is we're trying to achieve. And one of my hobby horses is data sharing, purely because of the integration aspects. And if you don't have a clear vision of what a good outcome would be, the market will pick one for you. And the question is, do you want to have this done to you, or do you want to shape what it looks like?
I think I'm with Mark on this one. There are some aspects where I look to government to give a clear direction of what is acceptable. So Mark gave the example of e-scooters and how technology has provided a solution that's created a problem that needs to be resolved. We've all heard over the last few days and are aware that the privacy concerns and data sharing and all of those things, and you relate that back to the Facebooks and the Googles, and how all of that is looking to be resolved is much bigger than just the tech companies. So I think there is a part to play where that wider social expectation aspect is the right and proper thing for government to intervene and set some guidelines, but in a way that doesn't create the unintended consequences or constrain the innovation. So within this space, I think the often quoted question is always about safety and what is safe enough in these new modes of transport where we don't have historical data to define what is socially acceptable for a large urban air mobility vehicle operating at high volumes at low altitudes over the city. Is the data set that is based on large commercial aircraft travelling long distances at high altitudes an appropriate reference? So I think there are frameworks there that we would need to look to the wider, bigger picture of government to give us some guidance that we can work to. But I don't think it should be in a detailed enough element that constrains innovation.
Thanks for the views. I mean, just some thoughts from me on that. As ever, it's an incredibly broad question. I think intervention could be a good thing where economic conditions wouldn't otherwise achieve an outcome that would be desirable. So one of the things that we've been discussing a lot recently is sustainable aviation fuel. If they're more expensive than kerosene, the market will not purchase them unless other external pressures are brought to bear that are seen as greater or equal to that financial impact. That's the kind of situation where the government could actively incentivise, and my view is incentivisation is always better than the alternative, to try and change that behaviour. But it is a tough question. So, a slight change in tack, and this is one for you, Mark, I'm going to come to first. So we heard earlier from Paul Clark, the CTO of Ocado, about a potential digital twin of the UK. So this is close to your heart. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think digital twin is on my buzzword bingo chart at the moment. That's the second time today I've been asked that question, actually. See how I get on with it. I mean, the key thing for me is really what do we mean by a digital twin? And it can mean clearly anything from having a model of a component within a complex vehicle through to having a really good idea of how people move through this space and how changes in maybe a room layout might affect how people use it. I think we're coming back to some of the challenges that you see about transport, which are around capacity and congestion and the impact on productivity. There's a real role for a digital twin that allows you to understand the best way to operate a set of infrastructure and the consequences of operating it in a different way, both from a planning and an operational perspective. And one of the challenges is to try and marry up all these visions we have of a digital twin and what we fundamentally mean by them, and how we can allow them to interact in an effective way. But it's got to be an incredibly positive thing to aim for.
Mike, do you have any views on that from an airspace perspective?
Yes, I'd agree with Mark in we have to be careful on what we think it is. This morning I had a conversation where it was viewed as being a full high-D definition virtual version of an entity. That entity could be the whole of the UK, every city within it, and every road and every traffic light. That comes with enormous cost. There are alternative models that are not as visual, but can have the same representation. So I think it's about understanding what is needful and useful and aiming at those, and not setting an objective that is so big and complex that we would never start on the project because it's just not affordable to deliver the benefits.
Anything to add, Robert?
Not on this, but I was thinking about disagreeing with one of the things you said earlier, just about sustainable fuels. I mean, I certainly agree with the point that there is a role for government to mandate the use of sustainable fuels, because airlines won't adopt it because they're 2 to 5 times more expensive than conventional fuels, and there's no supply chain anyway. But I think individual governments can't do it. I think it has to be done at a regional level. Otherwise, you just disadvantage the airlines which happen to fly within the UK. If BA has to pay to put SAFs in their tanks, whereas Lufthansa and Air France don't, all you do is you bankrupt BA. So I think you have to, as I said earlier, you have to operate these things at a regional level, which is why initiatives like Corsair are important, but then also immensely difficult given the need for, in Corsair's case, coordination at a global level.
I do agree, and we touched on it earlier with some of the things around unintended consequences. In reality, people are very good at getting around the rules that are set. So if you were to do something like that, do people just hop to Paris and then to cut their tax bill? And ultimately you end up increasing emissions as a result of that. So it's not a straightforward question. Which, fittingly, the next question on the list is about where you see current UK competitiveness versus other countries around the world in the kind of aviation space. So, Robert, I mean, you talked about the ability to do things at regional level. So, given that you've done quite a lot of research as a company into, things like eVTOL, What do you see as the current global trend?
Yeah, I don't know if I could comment intelligently on eVTOL in great detail, but I was also just going to question whether the idea of competitiveness at a national level has meaning in an aviation industry that's global, and therefore whether we are slightly talking about the wrong thing. I was trying to think of any aerospace company which operates solely within the UK and within the bounds of the UK and doesn't have international.
I think people are thinking of it more in the context of it's a global export market opportunity, and the general feeling seems to be at the moment in the sort of new, whether it's sub-regional, whether it's eVTOL, that there's a first mover advantage. And so if the UK gets left behind, are we then in a disadvantaged position?
But if you're a major company, aren't you going to have a strategy where you pick up technologies in whatever geography those are available and set up operations there, rather than just focusing narrowly on one country? So just disagreeing with the premise of the question.
Possibly. I mean, and that's actually a really interesting point. And I think it depends on the size of the company, the nature of their business.
Yeah.
And that's one of the questions that we've looked at through the conference. Are established companies essentially sitting too long on existing products and therefore laying themselves open for disruption? I think in the large space, the barriers probably preclude that. But in the smaller space, then who knows? Mark, any thoughts?
I guess maybe a comment on this one from the drones perspective, which we've been probably most involved with. In terms of competitiveness in the UK, I mean, clearly the platform market, that ship has sailed some time ago, and that's all very much commoditised now. But I think in terms of the infrastructure and the systems, there is still an opportunity for the UK to lead in that field. I think it's a window that's closing as other places around the world experiment and invest in this area, and hopefully things like future flight will have come along at just the right moment. But I guess maybe just to reflect on the current aviation system, we should remember that a lot of the infrastructure and regulation that was developed here in the UK has been successfully exported and set the rules around the world, and we should aspire to do the same. And at this moment in time, I don't see why we can't do that. But these things are changing rapidly, and the opportunities won't be there for long.
Mike?
I think Mark's just nailed the views I have, that this is very sector and very organisation specific. And we have to play for our strengths. There's no point chasing markets like the manufacturing aspect, which we've been out of the loop for a very long time. But where we have skills, expertise and knowledge that is current or close to being current, then yes, we should be fighting for that market share. My whole experience in the last 7-8 years in the drone space echoes what Mark just said, that we set out in the UK CAA, set out to export the thought leadership it had about drones, and that regulatory framework has been taken up by EASA and is now put into that rule set. We have the opportunity, the skills and knowledge to continue on that journey in terms of UTM and redesigning the airspace. But it's a very competitive, very fast-paced area of development, and if we don't grasp it quickly and with full vigour, others will take that opportunity from us.
So just on that thought then, so that leads neatly to the next question, which is coming back to you, Mike, because it's about how to manage the airspace. So do you think the best way would be to have specific highways in the air, or just a free-for-all? Bearing in mind we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Well, I'll keep it down to very short. We have both today. We have the airways in the controlled airspace and so forth, but you go into Class G, it's a see and avoid and go where you wish. All we need to do is propagate that philosophy to a greater degree of finesse and make it much more real-time adaptable. And the digital tools we're talking about allow that to happen. So I think we will continue with a mixed mode where it is right and proper to have effective pathways, and whether that is to minimise noise pollution over certain parts of the country, or it's the most effective way of controlling large volumes travelling in the same direction. We use the right tools for the right job.
Mark, any thoughts on that?
I think Mike has probably forgotten more about airspace management than I'll ever know, so I'm going to bow to what I think was a very well considered answer on that one.
I would do the same.
Fair enough. That's fair enough. Okay, so the next question is back to the kind of fundamental vision. So the question is, could we have a vision which doesn't include growth? It's a very broad question again. Mark, given that you look at other modes of transport as well, I mean, how do you think that would compare?
I mean, maybe a couple of thoughts here. So, and then we talked about the flight shaming thing a couple of times over these 2 days. I think the reality of that was brought home to me earlier this summer when myself and my wife secretly booked some flights for my kids to go on holiday, full of excitement, and unveiled this thing to them, and their faces dropped, and they said, "But what about the carbon?" First I was really embarrassed that I hadn't thought about that, and then it made me realise that actually, generationally, we're looking at this quite differently. And so I think that there is a real question mark about that future growth. And the only way out of it really is through being able to tackle the sustainability question. And, we're talking a lot about electric aviation, but we've got to find some really effective ways to generate electricity and store electricity. And even things like hydrogen. There's a number of different ways you can make it, but some of them are really carbon intensive. And the cleanest way to make hydrogen requires a lot of energy, which will probably drive innovation on a regional basis, because some geography will dictate that cheap clean energy might be easier to achieve in very windy places, for example.
Robert, do you have any?
I find it very hard to think of a future without growth, just because that's so baked into all of the assumptions about the industry that airline traffic will grow at 1.5 to 1.7 times GDP growth, because it has for the last 40 or 50 years. The other reason I think it's really difficult to envisage is that to get close to or approach net zero carbon, there needs to be a wave of investment. In order for the investment to pay off, then companies have to be able to earn decent returns. There are always two things which drive shareholder value. It's growth and margins. If there's no growth, then people won't fund the investment. So I think we need to find a way of ensuring that there can be continued growth in order to pull in the investment. Otherwise, I think the industry just runs the risk of going into reverse and sort of acquiring utility-like characteristics, or even worse than that. So I think we need to find a way of squaring the circle and ensuring there's continued growth to attract investment.
Mike?
I've always been, as an engineer, told revalidate your assumptions regularly. And so if I draw the analogy to the financial markets, and we're all used to seeing projected returns on investment at whatever percent, and we take our options based on how comfortable we are as to the risk of achieving those. So I think I'm not too averse to having a no growth situation, but on the premise that we've validated our assumptions that that's the best picture to enable us to plan what we will do going forward. So that could lead to growth, further growth afterwards, or at least a controlled alternative pathway into whatever the future will bring. So I think it's about validation, and it's about recognizing the different pressures that enable us to change what that model needs to look like.
I think a few thoughts from me to add to that. I think, could we have a vision without growth? I agree with a lot of the points that Robert made in terms of the business and financial side. Ultimately, we all work for companies that need to raise money to invest in technology. So without growth, the way that the current markets are geared, that wouldn't be seen as a positive thing, and it would make it harder. James McMicking talked about some of the scenarios that we've looked at in the ATI earlier, and some of those, if they come true, may provide a shift where growth is no longer the prime driver, and then I think we could see a scenario where we had a vision without growth. Personally, for me, a vision is meant to be something positive, so until that fundamental shift happens, that isn't something I would advocate. The final thought I'd have on that is, Colin Smith touched on it with his opening presentation yesterday. If you look at the percentage of global population that's never flown, it's actually very high. So all the data shows that when people get to a household income of about $25,000 US, they want to fly, they want to go and see the world. So I think the growth demand is huge and is there. It's our job to find a way to enable that growth, to connect the world better, but do it in a sustainable way. And that's the real thrust of the ATI strategy that we've been trying to put across. That's the takeaway message that I'd like you all to have. With one eye on the time, I'm fairly certain I know what the answer will be, but I'm going to ask you a simple question, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up. So, to paraphrase the question slightly, should flight-related taxes be directly ploughed back into aerospace innovation investment? Fairly quick answer, please, Robert.
Yes.
Thought you might say that. Mark?
Yes, but I mean that's a real political one, isn't it?
I think we're all going to agree, of course, and it is very, very political. But the US has shown precedence on investing the fines it took from the financial crash into innovative technologies. So it has been done before.
And you could argue that perhaps under ETS it is partially done at the moment, in that I think it's mandated that under ETS 50% of the revenues from auctioning permits that governments accrue go into green projects. So there is some precedent within ETS as well.
I think there are other really difficult taxation questions that we're going to need to answer. For example, as we gradually electrify our vehicle fleet, it's not going to be long before that creates a really large hole. So we'll see lots of other examples of how this kind of problem will have to be dealt with.
And on that bombshell, it's time to finish the panel. Apologies we couldn't get through all the questions. There are some other really interesting questions that we couldn't get to. We just don't have time. I hope you found it interesting. It just remains for me to say thank you to all the panel. It's been a really interesting discussion and good to have some debate and challenge. And thank you from me. I'm Dave Debney from the ATI, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.